Radical Forgiveness, God's Call to Unconditional Love by Zahnd. Forward. I have been waiting for a book like the one you are holding in your hand. I grew up a son of a Pentecostal minister. God found the way into my father's heart in a hell of communist concentration camp. From a raging atheist, he became a follower of Christ. He survived, barely, and joined a small Pentecostal church in the former Yugoslavia. He fasted for weeks to receive the baptism in the Spirit. He spoke in tongues, he had a gift of interpretation, and he practiced laying on of hands and praying for the sick. For 2 weeks in 1958, during a visit to the United States, he went to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and was taught by Oral Roberts. After my own brief stint as a prodigal, I was baptized in his church and became a committed Pentecostal. It is there that I preached my first sermon, and it is there that I made my first steps in leading the people of God. He had hoped that I would succeed him as the pastor of that church. It is also in my father's orbit that I wrote my first theological texts and undertook the translation of Christian books. As a teenager, I translated John Sherrill's book, They Speak with Other Tongues, into Croatian, a sympathetic report of an encounter with Pentecostalism. As a young man, I was an active Pentecostal, but that began to change after I arrived in California in the fall of 1977 and encountered American Pentecostalism. I went to study theology at Fuller Theological Seminary, not too far from Azusa Street in Los Angeles, the place where the original Pentecostal flame was lit. The May family, people as good as any I had met anywhere, gave me, a stranger, their TV room as my new home. As I flipped through the channels one evening, I stumbled upon an over-the-top flamboyant TV evangelist who was, among other bizarre things, pulling evil spirits out of people's ears. I was shocked, not so much by the strange spectacle as by what seemed to me a complete lack of spiritual depth. Soon, I found that he was not alone. On television and in many churches, preachers were peddling a compromised gospel of health, wealth, and power, which believers had a right to claim as their own by a simple act of faith. That seemed to me a faith designed not to direct people striving towards God and neighbor, but to feed the black hole of their self-absorption, and greed. When Pentecostalism came of age and gained some respectability, the vision of the healing of bodies expanded to include the goal of healing the nation. And yet the causes many Pentecostals took on were often driven less by the gospel of God's care for all than by concern for ourselves, our material well-being, and our security. Until recently, many Pentecostals supported environmental policies that consisted mainly in making sure that God's creation remains as unprotected from human rapaciousness as possible. This was a very short-sighted policy, even if one thinks only of human interests. The worst of it is that it was meant to be short-sighted, for soon the terrible day of the Lord would come, many believed, and the whole earth, with all its resources, would be swallowed up in one massive conflagration. So they reasoned we better rescue as much of it to our use as possible before it all goes up in smoke. Again, wealth and power were almost the exclusive concern. And then came the war against terror and the obsession with security. After 9/11, America was gripped by the spirit of the kick-butt culture, to use a phrase from Zahn's book. Many Pentecostals, along with many evangelicals, believed that the war was really a face-off between the Yahweh of the Bible and Allah, the moon god of the Quran. Soon after I arrived in the United States, I came to realize that American Pentecostals are among the most enthusiastic warriors in the culture wars and eager proponents of an aggressive foreign policy, especially unkind to the enemies of freedom, whether these are communists or Muslims. This was not the Pentecostal faith of the Azusa Street revival, of the band of those who gathered around William Joseph Seymour, and of the first generation of Pentecostals. And this was not the Pentecostal faith I learned from my father, a Christian with deep spiritual sensitivities, and a man who was gripped by God's love in the depth of his own misery. He believed that God lifted people out of poverty, but he was persuaded God does so primarily through people who are willing to give and work for the poor and disadvantaged. At our kitchen table, he never prayed that God would shower blessings on the poor, but that God would open our hands to be generous to them. He believed that people had the right to use the rich resources of God's creation. It would have never occurred to him, however, that this gave humans license to pillage and destroy what God has declared as good. As for enemies, he taught me that Christ died for the ungodly, as the Apostle Paul says. And he reminded me more than once that during his earthly sojourn, Jesus commanded his followers to love their neighbors, including their enemies. In his old age, he insisted that an Albanian Muslim, for whom he worked as a young confectioner, was the best man for whom I have ever worked. My father's Pentecostal faith and American Pentecostalism clashed in my experience. I felt a deep discomfort with American Pentecostalism. I knew, of course, that there was much more to it than the health and wealth gospel, disregard for God's creation, and an aggressive policy toward all enemies, domestic and foreign. My friends, like William W. Menzies, who befriended me when I was a teenager hungry for theological learning, Cecil M. Roebuck, with whom I taught at Fuller Theological Seminary, Joseph Cumming, who works on reconciliation between Muslims and Christians at the center that I direct at Yale, and many other American Pentecostals embody this alternative. And yet, what I saw in many churches and on television seems so acquisitive and aggressive, so self-absorbed and unforgiving, that I could recognize in it neither the faith of my father nor the faith of Jesus' followers. Now you know why I've been waiting for a book like Brian Zahn's Radical Forgiveness. In a fresh and compelling way, Zahnd urges all of us to give up on consumerism and hostility toward those who differ from us and practice generous and forgiving grace. His book is an urgent summons to conversion. It is an echo of the call that comes from the deepest abyss of God's heart, the call to find our deepest joy by becoming instruments of God's unconditional love. My Father is smiling from heaven, and maybe William Seymour is too. Miroslav Volf.